Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be talking about looping. Looping is a way that we can uh, repeat execution of the code. And you kind of see that here, execution of the code over and over again until a certain condition is met. Um, so you could use the example of somebody walking down a street and then running into a wall. They're going to take a step over and over and over and over again until they actually encounter a wall in front of them. And then you want them to stop taking a step. So the condition is there something in front of me? You can think of programming a robot. That's essentially how you would program a robot. You would tell a robot to continue to walk, continue to take a step until at some point in time there's an item in front of them. And when that item is in front of them, then they either have to turn left, right, or 180-degree turn. So that's essentially what a loop statement is. A loop statement is a statement that performs over and over and over again until a condition is met. The example we're going to be using in the program that I show you is going to be password application. So you've probably seen this several times when you've tried to log into certain websites. You can try and put your password in, your login and your password in until you actually get the right password. When you get the right login and password, then things move forward and you have the ability to kind of to move it to the next program. If you don't, it just continually shows the login screen over and over again until you actually enter the correct login and password. And so that's essentially in a loop. Well, it is in a loop. The code behind that actually runs a loop that continues to execute, continues to show you the login screen until you get to a point where you enter the proper password and username. And once that's done, you get to go into the program. Okay. And loops make the code much cleaner. There is a go-to statement in a lot of programming languages, and go-to allows you to kind of jump around to different lines of code. Go to 52 or go to whatever. And that is an old style statement that we used to use in older programming languages that when we didn't have loops available to us. But essentially, loops have eliminated the need for go-to statements, and it's a lot cleaner as far as moving forward. So there's three different types of loops that you can think of. There's actually a few more than that, but we're just going to focus on three types of loops that you can use in Visual Basic. The first one is a do loop. And a do loop evaluates a condition either before the loop performs, or it can perform the loop once and then evaluate the condition. An example of that would be that password application. So you see the login screen once, and then once you see that login screen, you can move forward from that. And then if you enter the wrong password in, it checks that condition, it checks the username and password. And if those are false, so if they don't match the actual username and password, then it shows the login screen again. That would be an example of a do loop that evaluates the condition after it performs at least once. A do loop that evaluates it first and then moves on is slightly different. So, for example, you might end up in a situation where you want to check the condition first. You don't even want to perform the loop until you know that that condition is true. And in that case, you would use a slightly different type of do loop, and I'll show you both types. So the first type here is the one that performs the statements at least once and then checks the condition. And you can see the example here, or this is the syntax that it would look like. So you have a do statement or a do command here. And then on the next line indented, notice the indentation, you have statements. Then you have a loop while section, right? And the loop while is loop while and then some sort of condition that you are going to test it against to make sure that it works. So you've got the opening do statement, then on the next line indented, you have all the statements that you want to perform while this condition returns true. Then you have your loop while, and then the condition that you actually want to test that on. And we can go forward and we can actually look at some more detail and then look at an example. So the statement is the loop that is executed at least once. So these are the codes that are actually executed at least once. The condition is some sort of a Boolean expression, like a less than or a greater than or an equal to a sign, statement. So it's some sort of Boolean expression that checks to see if something is equal to something or greater than something or less than something. So that condition will continually get checked, and until it's true, then we won't exit the loop. Okay, so here's an example. So if I've got a variable called num, and it's an integer and it's starting at the value 0, if I loop this, what I end up with is I end up with a do command, and it says num equals num plus 2. So it's going to add 2 to the number and then restore it in num. And it's going to do that loop while num is less than 10. So if we kind of step through that, you can see that as we see over here, keeping track of our variable, num starts at 0. If we move forward in that, it goes to the next loop. It performs num equals num times 2 automatically. Then it checks the loop while num is less than 10. So is number less than 10? Yep, it still is because we only added 2. Okay, it actually should be 2. It skipped a step here. Let's back that up. Okay, so we added 2. We check it down here. Loop while num is less than 10. Is num less than 10? Yes, it is. Okay, so then we loop back up and we go to the do, and then we continue this. So we say num equals num plus 2. So it adds 2 more to num and then restores it in num. So then we end up with 4. It checks loop while num is less than 10. Is num less than 10? Yes, it is. So it loops back up, adds 2 again. Now it's 6, still less than 10. So we perform another loop. It's 8, still less than 10. We perform another loop. Now it's 10. It checks this condition, and because this condition now is no longer true, it now will exit the loop. So it will then perform any of the code that's below the loop. So it will continue the code now because it will exit out of this loop. It no longer wants to loop back because num is not less than 10. Num is actually 10. Okay, so it exits the loop and then performs any statements that might appear after that. Now let's look at the second type of do loop. So the second type of do loop is where we can actually check the condition first before the loop ever starts to execute. So that is exactly the same statement as the do loop, as the first type of do loop. The only difference is we put the condition, the while condition at the beginning. So instead of it saying loop while condition, now we're saying do while condition. And then the statements go in between that and the loop command. So we end our loop with the loop command. So here's the same example, but just displayed using a do loop, a do while loop, sorry. So we have dim num as integer equals 0. Do while num is less than 10, num equals num plus 2. It's exactly the same process. So now we look at how that plays. Assigns the value 0. Do while num is less than 10, num equals num plus 2. So now it's going to add 2 to the number, and there it is. Then it's going to check the loop. It's automatically going to loop back up because our check is done up here. Okay, so it goes back up here, then it checks to see if num is less than 10. It is, so it continues through, adds 2 more, loops back up, then does the check again. Is it less than 10? Yes. Keeps doing so, adds 2, adds 2. Now it loops back, checks the condition again, but the condition is now false because num is not less than 10. So now it exits the loop and we no longer run the loop. Notice that the value of this loop is the same no matter whether we use the first type of do loop or a do while loop. That's okay, but the key difference between the two is that the do loop always performs the statements that are inside of the code, and then it checks it because you have a loop while statement at the end. Whereas the do while loop checks it first. So in a do while loop, you actually may never perform the statements inside because that check is happening right at the beginning. We'll have a look at a different loop. So here's a different loop, and there's something wrong with this loop. And so generally when I'm doing this, I'm doing this in front of a group of students, but the question I ask the students is, what is wrong with the following loop? So I want you to look at that and take a couple minutes, maybe pause the video for a second and see if you can figure out what this is. So please pause the video right now, take a few minutes, see if you can figure out what the problem is. Okay, hopefully that you paused the video, and then I want you to kind of look now, and I'm going to explain what the problem is. So if you look here, our integer value to start with is -1. and we say do while num is less than 0, which makes sense. But then we say num equals num minus 1. And then we loop. Well, here's the problem. Because it's -1 to start with, and num is equal to num minus 1, what's going to happen is that this loop is going to continually loop over and over and over again. It will never end because it will check to see if it's less than 0. It is, it's -1. So then num is equal to num minus 1. It will go to -2. It will loop back up, check to see if it's less than 0. It is, so it will subtract another one from num. Now we're on -3, -4, -5. You can see it will continue to go through that in the negative side until infinity. And in fact, what happens in Visual Basic is the program will crash because the number will get so large that it will actually exceed the integer. So as soon as it exceeds this integer, your program will crash because the integer can no longer handle a number as big as the number that ends up being. Okay, so in infinite loops, it performs a statement until the condition returns false. But if the condition never returns false, then your loop never ends. So you call that an infinite loop. And as I said, this loop will create an overflow error because the value will exceed its limits. The very next, or the last type of loop that I want to talk about is what we call a for next loop. And a for next loop is a more common type of loop that we use in programming. And it's usually used when we use something called arrays. Now, I don't know if we'll get to arrays this year. I'm hoping that we will. But arrays are a certain type of object in programming that allows us to store multiple objects all under one name. But for next loops can also be used when we're working with strings or when we're working with other types of objects that have a set size. Okay, and a for next loop is a loop that executes a set number of times. So we know before we ever even go into the loop how many times we want that loop to perform. So unlike the do while or the loop while loop that involves a condition, and then we don't know how many times that loop is going to run, a for next loop establishes the number of times first, and then it executes that number of times completely. So you can see here it's for counter equals start to end, perform the statements, and then there's a next counter. Okay, so that's the syntax, the for command, and then some sort of counter variable that counts the number of times the loop has performed equals the starting value of the counter to the ending value of the counter. And then all the statements that you want to perform in the loop go in here, and then you have a next, and then the variable counter, so the next counter, so it will go to the next value, and it keeps doing that until it hits this end value. So let's look at that. So here's another example, dim num as integer. And then we say for num equals 1 to 10, so there's the for statement, there's the counter, we're using num as our counter, equals 1 to 10. Show a message box, and then in that message box display whatever the value of num is, and then next num. So what happens is the variable num starts at 1. So the very first time this message box runs, it's going to show the number 1. Then it's going to go to the next num, which is 2. It's going to loop back up and it's going to perform these again. It's going to keep doing that until we get to the number 10. It'll display the number 10, it'll go to the next num, which is 11, and then that's outside of our boundary. So it will no longer perform any more of the loop. It will simply step out of the loop and continue with any lines of code that are written after this. Again, keep in mind this indenting. This indenting is really important in coding. It's not going to affect your code. Your code will still run if the indenting's not there, but it's important for the overall look of your code. Now, with the for next loop, you can include another command with that called the step command. And the step command will change the way the counter is being incremented or decremented. For example, here we can say for num equals 1 to 10, and we can step 2. So what that means is that it will skip every other, and it will go count by 2s. So in this case, it will start at 1, so you'll see the number 1 to start. Then it will next to num, But instead of going to 2, because we're stepping by 2, it will go to 3. So the next number that will get displayed in this loop is 3. Then it will display that, then it will go to the next number, and it will skip to 5. So the next number that will be shown in the message box is 5. And it will continue that way until, okay, 7, then 9 will be the last value you will see, because when it shows 9, it will then choose next num, it will go up by 2, and now we're at 11. And it will not perform the loop again because we're now stepping outside of the boundary of our for loop. Another way that the step command can be used is we can actually step a negative number. So if we want to count down, so in this case, num starts at 10. Notice that the start value is 10 and the end value is 1, but we step -1. So it's going to go backwards from 10, then it's going to go to 9, then it's going to go to 8, and so on all the way down, because this step command is telling it to step by -1. We show that message box, we go to the next num, and then it will continue that way. So those are the 3 basic loops that you have: a do loop, a do while loop, and a for next loop. If you need to, you can go back and watch this video over again. I've also included the notes in the course webpage, so you can have a look at the note that is exactly this note. It's just you don't obviously get me speaking over top of it. All right, guys, thanks.